This is Across Divides, a series of stories and experiences from communities across the island of Ireland as they meet shared challenges and consider opportunities for collaboration. Find out more at icommunityhub.org. Hello, I'm Alex McMaster, and in today's episode we'll be looking at how we can decarbonise the island in a just, sustainable and equitable way. I'm joined today, both in the studio and online, by three fantastic guests. Rebekah McCabe is joining us online. Rebekah is the Northern Ireland Engagement Lead at Involve, the UK's public participation charity. Her focus is on developing the awareness, understanding and use of participatory and deliberative tools across government and civil society. Also joining us online is Khalil Moran. Khalil is the project coordinator at the Democratic Workplace. They're studying a PhD with Community Research Council looking at community wealth building in Ireland. And we'll come on in a little while in a bit more detail onto what community wealth building is. And joining me in person in the studio is Susie Can. Susie has more than 20 years of experience in community development, education and project management across a wide range of sectors. She previously worked with the Think Tank for Action on Social Change's Climate Justice Centre, managing the People's Transition pilot projects. And again, we'll come on to that in a little bit more detail in a few minutes. But I'd like to start off with Rebekah. Rebekah, your inaugural project with Involve was the development of the first Citizens' Assembly in Northern Ireland. Could you tell us a little bit more about that process and how the learnings from that and the kind of principles of democracy have become so important in decarbonising the island?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first Citizens' Assembly for Northern Ireland happened in 2018. I was the project lead for that, and it was kind of my baptism of fire for deliberative democracy. It was a concept I kind of had a vague understanding of. And previous to that, I had been working for over a decade, kind of as an academic first, looking at urban sustainability and the kind of all of the complexities that happen when you bring in initiatives to local areas to try and make them more sustainable, including infrastructure and green spaces and other initiatives. And then also as a practitioner, I'd been working in kind of community development and participatory research for several years before that. So this kind of idea, well, the job when it was advertised really excited me, and the idea of deliberative democracy excited me too. So the project itself, the Citizens' Assembly, was an initiative that came about through several years of discussion between other civil society organisations around how to address some of the democratic deficit in Northern Ireland, looking to what was happening in the south as well as across the UK, and looking at kind of some of the political theory that was emerging at that time around what the issues were with representative democracy and electoral democracy. And then wanting to bring some of that learning to the context of Northern Ireland, finding itself a little bit stuck in terms of getting political buy-in. So getting the Northern Ireland Executive to commission a Citizens' Assembly. So it was really about civil society taking it upon themselves to fundraise and set that up. And they did that with the help of Involve. So our role was to set it up and do the design and the facilitation of the assembly itself. And I think the goal of that was to make recommendations on social care, but I think the secondary goal was also to prove that deliberative democracy can work in a post-conflict context just as well as it can work anywhere else, and that actually it can address some of the really difficult issues that emerge in a post-conflict context where issues of kind of universal importance like social care can sometimes get caught up in the very kind of divisive sectarian politics of this place. So we brought together a group of 80 people reflective demographically of the population of Northern Ireland, and then over 2 residential weekends they looked in detail at issues of social care and came out with a set of recommendations and kind of proved through doing that was something that there was capacity for here. And since then, I mean, that was 2018, which feels like a long time ago in the context of deliberative democracy. Since then, we've seen are real flourishing. And we've seen, I think, the OECD have called it a deliberative wave, just this massive uptake of these processes across global, national, local, community scales. And we've learned a huge amount. It's like anything, the process is constantly being refined and innovated. But I think that we're really seeing a shift in people's expectations of what the role of a citizen is in a democracy through these kind of, these demonstrations of deliberative practice.
And that role of the citizen, I guess, and is highlighted through that deliberative democratic process, which is becoming more and more central to this idea of a just transition. And another principle that is really a kind of a central tenet to that. I'll just come on to Khalil, because your work focuses on community wealth building, which is this concept that, well, I'll allow you to explain it rather than myself, because you'll do a much better job of it. I wondered if you could go into a bit more detail, just to kind of set the scene a bit in terms of what community wealth building is and why it's applicable in the context of the just transition.
Yeah, of course. And thanks for having me on today, Alex and Susie. Well, Susie is on as a guest. So community wealth building was kind of coined as a term around 2005, and it basically emerged out of a situation where local community activists and councillors kind of found that there was system capture at the level of the state, and if we wanted to democratize our communities, democratize ownership, create kind of sustainable and equitable models, economic models, that we were going to have to kind of look around in our own communities and ask, okay, what can we do? Because the traditional paths for that kind of thing are blocked at the moment. And I think probably the main areas where it's been implemented across the UK and in the US in a lot of towns that would have been hit by deindustrialization and the movement of manufacturing outside of countries. So places like Preston, different towns across Lancashire, the north of England, North Ayrshire as well, up around the border with Scotland, and Cleveland in the United States. So essentially what community wealth building is looking at is it's asking, what are the main mechanisms in our local communities whereby power, so like decision-making power, wealth and ownership, are flowing out of our communities and into the hands of small groups of unaccountable people who are, ironically enough, going to be the people who are least affected by problems like climate change or economic recessions that come around. So identifying what those mechanisms are, and then asking, okay, with our local institutions, our local public institutions, what can those institutions do to try and stop or reverse those flows so that they become, a really similar principle to what open democracy is based on, which is that the people who are affected by an issue should have a real say over what we decide to do about it. Not just because it's fair, but because we'll actually make decisions with more complete information, then we'll get better decisions being made. So community wealth building, then there's a whole heap of strategies within it, and we can talk about some more of them. I won't go into them all. If anyone is really interested in it, they can look at the Centre for Local Economic Strategies in the UK, their website, or the Democracy Collaborative in the US are the two main organizations kind of driving community wealth building. But essentially, yeah, you're looking at what are the levers that these local institutions can pull. So for example, progressive procurement rather than the traditional local development model of kind of outsourcing, public-private partnership, going for the cheapest option, rather than asking for you might go to your local university and say, guys, when you're tendering for your goods and services, rather than asking what is the cheapest option, can you put in social clauses? Can you look for the most environmentally friendly option? Can you look for an option that's going to hire from underprivileged communities, and kind of tying into that triple bottom line idea of social value and making decisions that way, rather than always just looking at it in terms of what is the cheapest option, because the cheapest option, as we know, is often not the best option for our community. So yeah, we'll talk more about it, but I think that's pretty much the gist.
Yeah, super. Thank you. I suppose that both the principles you just described, both Khalil and Rebekah, they're both means of empowering communities towards achieving a more equitable transition. And that's something, Susie, that you've certainly brought into your work with the People's Transition pilot projects, putting those kinds of principles, among others, at the centre of 2 pilot projects with 2 different communities in the Republic of Ireland. I wondered if you could go into a bit more detail into those projects and how you've been able to use the kinds of principles and put them into practice that have just been described.
Yeah, well, just to give a little bit of background on the model and the concept of the People's Transition, that came from, TASC has been a think tank for social change for 20 years in the Republic, and setting out to work in research that can be put into action in social change, from being the annual report on equality, to different aspects of social care actually being one, and health and access. So a few years ago, I think about 4 years ago, they realised that they were positioned to also look at climate justice, and Sean McCabe worked for 3 to 4 years really developing several different research strands under that climate justice centre that was set up within TASC. And then one of them, at about, I think it was published in November 2020, was a piece of research that he did, having travelled around rural Ireland to communities that have many different community development needs, and who see the coming changes under climate action as more likely to be a burden to them than to have any benefit. And particularly farming communities, but other communities across the island. And so out of that, I suppose he looked at trying to develop a model that, because this is then a big question of his research had been, if from the UN to the Green Deal in Europe to our national governments in both jurisdictions of these islands, are all trying to implement really rapid climate action. And if they're doing that without widespread public support, what could be a game changer in that picture? What would bring about widespread public support, and not the feeling that climate action is going to burden people? And in fact, in 2021, while I was rolling out this attempt to pilot this idea that the People's Transition is, there was another piece of research that Sean did that's published on the TASC website called Talking Green, and it basically asked people about where they prioritised climate action against other priorities in their life, and it specifically looked at different socioeconomic and age demographics, and really universally it's not the top priority for anybody. Housing, health, education, all sorts of flexible employment, many different things take precedence in people's lives. So what the model of the People's Transition that Sean developed is what if we could design climate solutions that met local community development needs? Then there might be an increased demand for climate action, because people would see it bringing benefits, not burdens. And as part of that, it looked at community wealth building and a model of community capacity building, to be able to be these actors of community-led local development and community-led climate action and climate solutions. And it's built in actually at the various COPs, and the most recent COP, and at UN level and at European Green Deal level. It's built in to a lot of the dialogues that say, communities must lead the way on this, or communities must be empowered to do this. But very often, when being discussed, what comes up much more often, and there's huge investment now coming into the Republic of Ireland, Northern Ireland, the UK, all of Europe, setting aside this stimulus packet for climate action. But when it kind of comes to it, in the solution rooms at the the top down is really saying, oh, well, we'll get a multinational to build it and do it and fix it. And so that really, the People's Transition is about going and talking to communities about their community development needs, and then working with climate action, climate solution experts, people who have the what a multinational would tap into without any difficulty to create a business model. They would tap into subject matter expertise, to academics, to new research areas, and develop a business plan, and be able to, as Khalil was talking about, extract the wealth from the community very, very quickly. But communities don't always have access to that. So what Tasks Climate Justice Centre is trying to do is look at the community development needs and then design solutions around those and give access to expertise, which I can tell a little bit more about later, about what we actually came up with in Ardara and Phibsborough, the 2 pilot communities that we worked with for a 7-month period.
I suppose that climate change is being presented so much as the major issue of our times and the major challenge of our times, and it is something that, as Susie just said, needs to be addressed so rapidly, that it is something that requires such a rapid response, that it needs such a large scale response. Can that be addressed in the sort of typical way? I'm sort of coming back to the general idea of a just transition and a people's transition and a community-led transition, as to why that's necessary in contrast to existing power structures, I guess, and why they're not able to deal with the crisis.
Yeah, and I'd be curious, Rebekah, about why it is a crisis of democracy. Why that rapid pace could lead to, we don't have time for deliberative democracy.
Yes.
We don't have time to talk, to empower.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, we need a rapid response because for the last 40 years, there hasn't been sufficient action on it within democratic nations. And I mean, even now, no democracy has a plan to deal with the climate emergency that lines up with the goals of the Paris Agreement even. So there is a real question that I think a lot of people are afraid to ask, which is, can democracies cope with this issue? And I think that the reasons why we are struggling to cope with these issues is because of some issues that are really baked in, or characteristics that are really baked into our current democratic system, and that's issues like short-termism, so how election cycles and the focus on winning votes can shape agendas and shape how decisions happen. The role of the media, the role of people who are the kind of holders of evidence and expertise, and how they relate to the public. Obviously, the influence of political interests, and as we talked about earlier in the context of community wealth building, that idea that the people selected often hold so much power, and it's not accountable power, and it's not always visible power either. But I think there's also a political culture that needs to be described. Like the status quo of our political culture needs to be described a bit more fully, and that includes things like norms of political discourse. So how do we talk about things? We don't talk about things in a particularly healthy or productive way. Our public discourse is very fractious. It's very adversarial. It tends to be competitive and persuasive. I'm trying to convince you that my idea is better than that other idea. And I mean, that runs right through from the kind of things that we see, the comment sections on social media, right through to parliamentary debates. That's a key feature of how we communicate with each other. Rather than an alternative, which is consensus seeking or deliberative. And I think, as you said, Susie, that the alternative to that can be very scary, because we are seeing people advocating for less democracy and a kind of eco-authoritarianism, or giving more power to people who hold expertise. And I think partly that's a sign of a real poverty of our imagination of what democracy could look like. and that's sort of where we come in as an organization, in terms of advocating and expanding people's imagination for what democracy could look like, but also demonstrating what it looks like when it's done, and doing work like citizens' assemblies at the national level. And we have been the lead organization for several of the climate assemblies across the UK in the last couple of years, but also getting right down to that community level as well, and bringing those deliberative tools to a community level so that people are equipped. They're given the evidence that they need. They're given that kind of facilitative support to be able to talk through what the issues are that they face, how these big, very remote and abstract global phenomena impact on local communities actually, and so that they can find ways of facing the future together as communities, and cutting through, as you say, that fear that can lead to and showing that there are opportunities, starting with what assets are held locally, what do you like about your area, what is there already existing that we can build on, and what might a response to this look like, that you can all agree with. And I mean that's so important for this kind of wicked problem of climate change that connects with so many things. There's a danger that it remains remote until it's too late, and we do have no option left, but an authoritarian response. But I think people have, we see it, Susie. If you talk about the projects you've done, I'm sure you've seen it as well. That when you give people real opportunities to think about their future, they really respond to that, and people really want to be part of the solution. But we're really impoverished around the opportunities, the mechanisms, the processes that we have available to us right now to enable that kind of, I don't know, you can call it empowerment, but that kind of that opportunity for people to connect with each other and build consensus and solidarity, and collaborative, cooperative solutions to this.
I think, Susie, perhaps, you mentioned there, Rebekah, a few, I guess, some aspects of that did come into Susie's work. So I'd actually quite like to just ask Susie, could you pick up on that and describe how they did come into your work with People's Transition?
Well, yes, I think that the model actually as designed was to have mini publics, mini citizen assemblies in the communities. Now, the pilot was rolled out during COVID year, and so that meant that they had to be really mini. Some of the focus group sessions in outdoors in Ardara in a tent, but the idea of that people are best positioned in their own communities to know what the issues are, and also to signpost and to point to opportunities that they may not have had the ability to develop or, as you say, cooperatively own and cooperatively develop. So that was very key to the model. There was a kind of 3 phases of the pilot. One was a desk-based mapping of who is in the community, and because it took this rights-based approach, to who are the voices that aren't heard or are least likely to be heard or most often excluded from mini public or focus groups or talking to people or interviewing. So we did look at having rapporteurs, and by having the desk-based study, you knew if I was in Ardara, for example, and I didn't talk to any fishermen, or any carers that were there in the CSO data, that I wasn't doing a good job, So looking at that to be sure that you look for the voices in community development, it's actually been a key principle always to pay attention to who's not in the room. And so that was part of the approach, was to seek out and make sure, because if you're going to identify the different needs, you could completely hear from one segment of a community, oh no, we don't have any housing needs here, and you're maybe not talking to all of the segments. So that was an important part of, and then through that process, though, I think, that you're also trying to identify the opportunities. Now, one of the things that is central to the community wealth building model was that it is trying to look at local institutions that could be anchor institutions, And I'd be interested, Khalil, because one of the things we found was that in the Phibsborough urban community, that was quite easy to identify. There was, in the catchment of the area of the project, there was a prison, there is Dalymount, there are public institutions and community-owned institutions that could potentially serve as these anchor institutions, which you could maybe explain a bit more why that's important. That was actually really challenging in Donegal. You had this really, really engaged community. The older members of the community we spoke to talked about an erosion of local democracy. They talked about parish councils that had existed in the past and how they had a say in budgeting, for their area. But when we went to look at that in Donegal County Council, even them knowing themselves at a kind of granular detail what is spent and how it's procured, is the data wasn't there, So I'm curious, like when you're looking at it across the Republic of Ireland, are we equipped to, like, what would we need to do to have those anchor institutions to really look at how, for example, in Phibsborough, one of the solutions that we explored was a retrofit cooperative. And it would have been amazing if we could definitely link to Dublin City Council or the prison or any other big public institution that has to do retrofitting, and they would then be this anchor for community on business to say, we have housing stock actually, and we can get you to do some of ours as your cooperative, and then that's going to help you get going as a community on business. So I don't know, I'm curious, are you finding in the research you've done so far that there's going to be those kinds of data barrier or practice barriers? Because as you said, it's community wealth building is much more developed now. I was looking actually at those border regions of Scotland and the kinds of things they're doing across whole council areas. Do you think that we're going to get there through the research you're seeing?
Yeah, I think one of the things about community wealth building is it's trying to be something that's adaptable to different circumstances. I know that it sometimes gets referred to as the Preston model, and Matthew Brown, who would have driven a lot of that, would say, it's not the Preston model because it has to be what we did in Preston isn't going to work elsewhere. If you look at the United States, when they started out with the Democracy Collaborative, union participation has really declined over there. And so it got criticized maybe for not involving unions in the UK, because in the UK, union participation is still much higher. So there's an opportunity there to take advantage of that. So sometimes different areas have strengths. I think in Ireland, we definitely have some limitations that the UK and the US didn't have as much. So our councils are underfunded, even relative to the underfunded councils in the UK. I'm not sure what the figures are now, but I know maybe 6 or 7 years ago, less than 10% of our tax take went to local government. You look at, for example, Scandinavia, the average across those countries would be over 40%. So they have a lot more that they can mobilize to kind of do stuff like this. As well, we're less densely populated, so we have more rural areas that don't have as many obvious anchor institutions. I think that's definitely a big thing. I think there was a big missed opportunity. Maybe it hasn't been fully missed. A couple of years ago, the Public Banking Forum of Ireland, together with a huge group of community organisations in the West and the South, together with the public banks in Germany, the Sparkassen, who have funded a huge amount of the renewable energy community-owned schemes in Germany. They made a very detailed proposal for something similar here and for public banks in the Midlands, which would be extremely powerful anchor institutions. And the government needed to, they went to the government for a relatively small amount of startup funding, and they didn't get it. But that's still kind of mothballed in the corner. That could be brought back to life if there was a bit of movement behind it, and if people took hold of that and really pushed for it. So you could create anchor institutions as well. But yeah, I definitely think there's a lot of things that can be put in place that aren't there right now. I think different forms of measurement. We need local measurements for when we are tendering for things. Do we have mechanisms to to measure the economic footprint of a project and the benefits there. I don't know that we have those measurements yet. Worker cooperatives would be a big part of community wealth building because they have so many advantages. They're never going to leave the country to go somewhere that has cheaper labor because they're entirely owned and managed by local people. Any profits that they get are either going to be reinvested in better wages and then better quality of life in local communities, stimulates economic activity, or reinvested in the company to grow Indigenous enterprise, which has been a huge problem historically for Ireland. We've obviously put all our eggs in the basket of foreign direct investment. So they're really good. They stack up in terms of productivity to their peers that are hierarchical. You have better well-being reported by the people that work in these kind of companies, and you can pair them with anchor institutions, with a university like you're talking about, Susie. Exactly. You can actually, historically, a problem for them is that they can't get funding from banks because banks want to own a company. They want to own a part of a company. They want an equity stake in something, or finance wants an equity stake in something. So if they can't have it, they're not interested. Whereas if you pair worker cooperatives with an anchor institution, you go, okay, what are the procurement needs of the local police force or the local hospital? And you set up, like in Cleveland, they grow a lot of their vegetables locally. That was one of the needs that was identified locally. They created a solar-powered laundry. That was another need that was identified locally. And so when those co-ops started, they had guaranteed demand already. They didn't need to go out and find a market. So it was much more of a secure and mutually beneficial thing. But in Ireland, we actually don't have any legal framework for worker co-ops. We don't have any law. Our cooperative legal framework is over 100 years old, and that's currently under review. I'm not sure that it's particularly high on the priority list within that conversation to get worker cooperatives in there, but I think it should be. That would be another thing that we could get in place that would make a big difference. And again, I think it does tie back into a democratic deficit where, you can argue whether we're a democracy or not, but you certainly can't argue the point that we could be a much more democratic democracy. If we go to work and we're told what to do all day, and the people in the workplace don't have much of a say. I'll always remember when I worked in a clothing store, one of my early jobs, and there was a big sale on for a couple of days, and we're told we gotta really pull it out of the bag here and do this sale. We're going to make a lot of profits, and everyone just walked away thinking, but I mean, we're not going to see any of those profits. Why do management think we care? So I think that people do want to have a say, and they do want to be part of the solution. And we're all talking about this stuff anyway, but we need to be talking about it in the rooms where the decisions are getting made, because there's so much intelligence and creativity in our local communities and ordinary people that is untapped right now. Yeah.
I think what I'm gathering a lot here is the kind of empowerment of communities and ownership, and that through perhaps ownership, the people owning solutions is kind of a means of giving people that kind of feeling of really enacting change themselves and being empowered to do so. And I'm just wondering, on a kind of a practical level, whenever communities are given that kind of empowerment, whether it be through more funding to local government, or whether it be the provision of expertise or access to resources, what that actually then looks like, or whether there are examples that kind of demonstrate what that looks like, just to kind of see what is the kind of something that we can hold and kind of really see. And I don't know if that's something that came through in your work, Susie, or if either Rebekah or Khalid would have anything to add to that.
Well, I'd definitely be interested to hear about some of the UK examples of because you're working, Rebekah, across the whole of the UK. But I'll give you one really quick example from the Phibsborough project. And the Dublin City Council is currently looking at the idea that replacing cars with bicycle delivery, or vans with bicycle delivery, is a good idea. So an idea can emerge in another country. There are solutions all over the place to many of the things that we're all trying to tackle. But the go-to for the Dublin City Council was to have a conversation with DHL about having bicycle delivery. And the idea it being that the last mile of a delivery in a city is often in an empty van. So you have this last mile and it's a huge carbon output in terms of transport. And, at the same time that we encountered an initiative, big, very, very fledgling thing that we were able to bring research support to was a bike cooperative, a workers-owned bike cooperative. And that it met a whole lot of other needs, as you're saying, there's other things you look at than the bottom line. So it met the needs of vulnerable, usually migrant workers, being delivery people, not owning their bicycle, and not owning any part of the profit. And so we were able to bring some research expertise and connect this fledgling group and a bunch of people together to start at least exploring the idea of a workers-owned bike cooperative for last mile delivery. And you could see, like, the residents of Hibsborough that we were talking to, they could see immediately that the relationship would change with a delivery person who shows up at your door and is the same person on a bicycle each time a delivery is on your street, versus the relationship with a van driver, for example. And I think some of the research that was in that looked at a couple of other bike-owned cooperatives that also used a platform, like Deliveroo or one of those big companies has a platform for doing the orders, and there's a workers-owned bike app across Europe. So, that's something that a cooperative bike organisation could use. So the thing about how things that then become community-owned tend to help other community-owned things was really a nice example in that particular one, because the one that had created the app, that's an open source information for bike cooperatives across Europe to use, so as that bike cooperatives could be owned, or delivery cooperatives could be owned by the workers. So that's sort of, it sounds convoluted because it's interconnected and it is complex in certain ways, but in other ways the principles are really, really simple. They're not complicated. There's a complexity of an issue, but often the solutions are very simple, and they don't need to be complicated to manage what might seem at first a complex issue. So I don't know, Rebekah, have you other examples in the UK of where, having had deliberative, activating democracy, or Khalil in the research, that you're seeing examples of that actually making a difference to when people do have access to a more participatory democracy?
Yeah, as you were talking, my mind was kind of racing through all of the processes that we've done in the last couple of years to try and pick out an example. It's really challenging. I mean, across the board, I think one of the things that comes through is sort of what you've described, which is that people, I think very often politicians misunderstand people's attitudes around some of these issues, or there can be a little bit of condescension around that, and people are often, or the excuse is often made around not involving people more in decision making, that they don't necessarily have the cognitive capacity or the information. I mean, you can give people the information, and you can create conditions where cognitive capacity is enhanced, which I think deliberation does. And I think very often what we see across the board are that the recommendations that come from deliberation diverge quite a lot, either from what we know about uninformed public opinion, or from what people think the public's opinion is, and whether that's around the location of kind of onshore wind farms, or pedestrianizing urban neighborhoods to increase active travel. The public are generally more supportive of that once they've been given the facts and time to kind of reason it out. So, and it doesn't always mean that they have shifted across the political spectrum from one side or the other, but they have just looked at a problem. They've heard options for different solutions, and they've come to a recommendation, and very often that recommendation differs from what politicians thought that they would find acceptable. And I mean, it's interesting. We just this weekend, I've come back from a town in Yorkshire called Selby, where we've been doing we've been applying some of these deliberative approaches to a community. So it's a small town, sort of in the shadow of a big coal-fired power station, which has recently just shifted to burning biomass. But so we ran 2 weekends of deliberative processes to engage that community on local solutions to the climate emergency, or local responses to the climate emergency. And it's really interesting how they can take so many kind of intertwined problems in all of their complexity, and see very clearly the ways in which they interact and come up with solutions, just as you've described. So, and a lot of their solutions would be for more cooperative approaches, for a local sharing economy. So things like 2 libraries that don't always make it onto political agendas, but the public see the benefits of these kind of approaches and really advocate for them. And I think it's interesting when we bring stakeholders into these processes as well. They're always really struck by the kind of the good faith with which people participate. And like you described earlier, Susie, a mini public, and maybe for listeners, it's helpful to define what that is. So that's a mini public is a group of people who've been selected at random. And there's various methods through which that happens, but they're selected at random to look more or less demographically like the population that they kind of like they reflect. So whether that's at a town level or a national level. And the idea behind that is that it's people who don't necessarily take part in these kinds of civic conversations generally. Some people will, but a lot of people who take part won't, and they're often incentivized as well. So you would give people some kind of cash or a gift incentive for taking part. So people come for all kinds of reasons, and people will tell you that they've come for all kinds of reasons. I came for the money. I came to get away from my kids for a couple of days. But regardless of that reason, once they're in the room, they really engage with good faith. And for stakeholders who are used to doing consultations where they are essentially presenting what someone else thinks is a good idea, defending it, and sort of batting away criticism, they are not used to seeing the public like that. And I think it really drives home this idea of, that the public at large are really sensitive to the level of power that you are giving them in a process. And they know when something is tokenistic or tick box, and they will often come with hostility to those kinds of processes. But when you set up a process and facilitate it properly to find solutions, they will come in good faith, and they will work really, really hard to find solutions. And they will come much more often with a spirit of kind of common ground and a goal to find a common good rather than a self-interested good. So that's more of a category of or like a characteristic of recommendations than any specific recommendations themselves, but it's something we see again and again in these processes.
Something I'd be really interested in looking at is, you described, Rebekah, a couple of times how this kind of, the empowering communities can be a more effective way of delivering on something like a just transition or decarbonisation. And everyone, I think, has mentioned an element of collaboration between, whether it be anchor institutions or other community organisations, communities with one another. And when we're looking at the issue of climate change as an all-island challenge, it's something that doesn't necessarily recognise 2 jurisdictions, and even outside of the island of Ireland, it's not something that recognises any other jurisdictions necessarily. Where there are barriers in the kind of governance, the sort of classic sort of political governance response, can those kind of barriers be overcome and those kind of challenges be better met by collaboration between communities that are perhaps able to bridge some of those divides that otherwise exist?
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think, to be honest, if we don't, activate the kind of democracy that Rebekah's organisation is working on, and if we don't have that broader sense of what community wealth building and the capacities of communities supported. Look, so, this investment, this stimulus that is coming into the Republic of Ireland. I think Sean McCabe characterised it at one point as being, the biggest stimulus package since the foundation of the Republic of Ireland. And if we don't figure out how communities benefit through those, and as you say, I do see the wealth of will, the wealth of desire to help and step in and to be part of solutions. But I also know that people's capacities have to be supported to actually be able to follow the money and benefit in community. So the following the money path that the community wealth building brings in, I suppose, is why that's such a core conversation, because otherwise that stimulus package, honestly, if that is through the more extractive model of massive multinationals being capturing that purse, we won't get out of this. It's not really an option to say that we could do it another way, and that's actually very recognized at all levels of government. But I think that the community sector, what's challenging is that it often hasn't got communities don't always have capacity, and there's reasons for that, so I suppose but I think collaboration in this kind of conversation and talking across the civil society actors and the research and the academic, it's that collaboration that allows to push forward these agendas to make a capacity change, to make because that's a measure, that's a real measure of what do I in my community feel capable of making a change, around me. And I certainly working, and I've worked recently as well with 7 communities in West Cork, and they were doing what I suppose is the traditional sense of co-production in community development, where you do the kind of work that Rebecca's talking about, and you talk about what could we do, and communities come up with the most amazing projects and have a certain amount of capacity. But it's very obvious when you work with lots of different communities that not all communities have the same capacity. So for me, that collaboration and that support is going to be, it has to be following the money and giving people the capacity through the exact same way, as I said, that it could go another way, that, that capacity could remain with the same few, and then we don't have anything that is just. And I suppose I really liked your phrase about imagination, Rebecca, because I think you're not the only one who has talked about climate change. I think George Monbiot and others, Naomi Klein, they talk about climate change is a failure of imagination. And I know that Rob Hopkins from the People's from the a different name Transition Towns movement has looked a lot at that imagination. And so I'd be really interested, I know we don't have a lot of time left, but like Khalil and Rebecca, in your imagination for what is actually possible if we were collaborating, across these islands, across the globe, what would community wealth building for you, Khalil, actually look like? What would the most amazing, collaboration actually be like, and how quickly could we do it? What are we going to need?
Yeah, I think I had a question for you, but I'll sit on it. I'm really interested in those mini kind of publics within a community. I might send you a text about that instead. I think there's actually really exciting potential in Ireland, and I really think that the open democracy and community wealth building stuff are very complementary. They're kind of like different arms of a solution to the same problem. So I would be rolling them together in my mind anyway. But with Ireland, because we're such a small country, I think that to me anyway, the biggest service we can do is become a model for other countries to follow. If you look at the kind of extractivist moving resources into the private sphere, austerity-based economic model we've had for the past 40 years, that basically started with a model in Chile under Pinochet. They kind of tried it out there and they were happy enough with the results. So then they tried it out in the UK, and it's been what we've been living under ever since. So I don't think there's any reason to think the same process couldn't happen in reverse. You know, maybe you get the model that breaks through in a smaller country, and then you bring that to scale elsewhere. And I think within Ireland, we can have a kind of a similar. I think it's important that we sort of have a theory of social transformation. We have an idea of how this might work, and I think I'd be thinking about. I think Eric Olin Wright has a really good way of looking at that, where he's talking about the dual strategy of, on the one hand, you're building models, you're doing that kind of think global, act local work with community wealth building and mini publics and worker cooperatives and mobilizing your anchor institutions at a local level. And you're also creating your social capacity in your community groups and your council, saying, here, we're doing this, and pushing for policies at a state level, because you do need, I don't think you can do everything at a local level either. You need the grassroots and the top down to meet each other in the middle. And I think there is really a specific actionable path for people to take if they want to kind of row into that process. And I really do think it's achievable. You could start, if you were listening to this podcast and you're like, God, that was really interesting. What will I do tomorrow? Even that idea of, maybe I can go into my council, or maybe I can talk to a few people and we can go in and say to our council, can we set up these mini publics for what we can do in our community, and at least create the scope for those conversations to start happening. You don't even need to you don't need to have it figured out. You just start those conversations and kind of base it on those principles. I really liked what you said about identifying who's not in the room. That's brilliant to kind of do that and get them in the room. And from there, you'll get all kinds of creativity. I mean, one problem that's very unfamiliar for people, I think, in most of our organizations, is too many good ideas. But when you get a room full of people, a diverse room of people from different backgrounds, you're going to find very quickly you have too many good ideas, and you have to kind of discipline yourself like it's a big batch of Ferrero Rochers, and sort of do one at a time or a few at a time. So I think it would look a little bit like that. That would be my model for how can we kind of move forward on this. Yeah, I'd be interested to hear from Rebekah on that too.
I think, by the way, you're absolutely right about the dual track of a place to meet in the middle from the top-down grassroots, and that was another strand of the People's Transition pilot. And we did get really good engagement with ministers and TDs in the local area of Donegal, and also the local development company, who are tasked with community-led development in their funding models and so on. And actually they were really responsive to, yes, this is what we're trying to do, and they didn't have all the ingredients. So, the collaboration's key, all right.
Rebekah, do you
I
have anything to add?
Yeah, I think that meeting in the middle is so important, and I think it's so important that's understood as a bit of a shift in power as well, and that there's a shift from kind of seeing the public as just people who kind of consume public services, or people who are an obstacle to a political vision getting realized, which often happens. I mean, it does happen. I'm living it in the moment in my neighborhood in Belfast, where a cycle lane has polarized the entire community because the communication and engagement around it was done in very, very poorly, and it's to me it's just such a big example of the risks if we don't take these approaches. As you said, Susie, there is no other way anymore. We have to figure out how to do this. But yeah, that the public can be collaborators with institutional stakeholders. We can share power. We can share responsibility for what happens, and I think that's really important to see. And in terms of imagining, I mean, oh God, like if I think about a just transition, which I think will be a transition forever. Like, I don't think it's a transition into another fixed destination. I think it's something that we're going to have to be prepared to constantly work on and negotiate and kind of talk that idea of talking it into being. But I think if we look at 2050, we imagine ourselves into 2050 and kind of dare to hope that we have somehow achieved this and we have managed to mitigate the worst effects of this, and we still we still have a livable world. And then if you work backwards from there to think about, okay, well, what kind of ways are we in relationship with each other in order to have reached that? I mean, I don't think that our current way of doing politics or doing decision making continue. I don't think that they can. So I think we need to start thinking about a shift in norms a little bit. So, like I said at the beginning, that goes down to shifting the norms of how we talk to each other. Just that very basic thing of how do we talk to each other about issues that are difficult in a public setting. We've done workshops. We've done deliberative workshops with elected reps as well, so kind of closed. So we've just given them opportunities to deliberate over issues. And they love it. They love being freed up from that debate format, that adversarial format. So even that shift of a norm of deliberation everywhere. So not just deliberation, it can't just be deliberation is something that the public does, but this adversarial debate and persuasion is something that happens in every other political sphere. I think normalizing deliberation across our society is really important. And also normalizing the idea of like a citizen mindset. And that's something that requires us to stop being individuals a little bit and stop being consumers a little bit and stop even just being family units, like that kind of separation that we feel, and start thinking much more in terms of our relationships with other people, with other entities, with the earth as an ecological entity. Like all of those things are things that are absent, and their absence has gotten us to this emergency that we're in now. So that's a huge ask, but I think we need to rediscover some of the tools for being connected and being together and being in community that I think we have in our human history, but we have lost. So I think this area of work is often called democratic innovation, which makes it sound very modern. But I think it's actually about rediscovering things that we have in us. I think we're innately a cooperative species, but it's about kind of creating the opportunities for that best of us to come out, and we're kind of to go back to the theme of impoverishment, we're kind of impoverished in terms of that as well. So that's my kind of my bravest imagining of what the future is that norms have shifted to be more deliberative, and we have a stronger sense of ourselves being in community with others.
I think, what you've just described, I guess, kind of sums it up really well. That this is a journey that's not necessarily towards a fixed ideal of what things can look like, and that setting out on it, as Khalil said beforehand, doesn't need to be something that we already have an idea of what that end goal is going to be. We hear so much in the kind of sphere of climate politics, these goals, we're going to keep to a certain number of degrees of warming, or we're going to achieve net zero by this year, and these are real sort of fixed goals, and then kind of figuring out, well, how are we going to get to those? But I guess what we're looking at here is from a different perspective. We're working from starting those conversations, as Khalil suggested, taking those tools and empowering people so that they can start those conversations and start working towards those solutions, not necessarily knowing exactly what the end goal is going to be, but eventually reaching it, and eventually reaching a transition that is equitable and sustainable and just for everyone across the island. So thank you very much to all of you, to Rebekah and Khalil for joining us online, and also to Susie for joining in the studio. It's been a really interesting discussion. Thank you.
You have been listening to Across Divides. Learn more about today's topic and find opportunities to get involved at icommunityhub.org. iCommunity is a joint initiative of the Wheel and NICFA and is supported by the Northern Ireland Department for Communities, the Department of Foreign Affairs Reconciliation Fund, and the Shared Island Unit in the Department of the Taoiseach.